Hello, everyone, and welcome to Broadcast, the official radio show and podcast of the Society of Graduate Students at Western University. I'm your host, Yusuf.
And I'm your co-host, Reese.
And today we are here with Elizabeth Moeller, and she is an incoming student in occupational science. She's going to do a PhD over here. So welcome to our show, Elizabeth.
Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Sure. So Elizabeth, tell us about yourself and what made you to choose to come to Western, and also about your interest in disability advocacy.
Sure. So I am as Yusuf said, an incoming PhD student at Western University. And I have worked in the field of disability, or in the disability space, I guess you could say, for my whole life. I would say I live with a visual disability, and so my reasoning and my thinking behind wanting to pursue a PhD is really, I guess, because of my own experience with advocacy work and the need to advocate. So prior to coming to Western University for my PhD, I worked at Ryerson Magnet. And I was the project coordinator for inclusive hiring.
Okay.
And prior to that, it's a really neat job. Loved that. And prior to that, I worked in frontline service work at Balance for Blind Adults, where I taught individuals with vision loss how to use assistive and mainstream technology. As well, I was the community engagement lead at Balance. And sort of prior to that, but also at the same time, I worked for the National Educational Association of Disabled Students, or NEEDS, working in the inclusive education space. So I should back up there and say that inclusive education is one of my big passions. I currently sit on the Education Standards Development Committee for post-secondary. And why is that a passion for me? Well, as somebody that lives with vision loss, I have experience navigating barriers around education from primary all the way up to post-secondary. And in my frontline work, I worked with a lot of clients who experienced barriers to education. So, for example, one of the biggest barriers that I still experience, and it's certainly been exacerbated as we're now all using technology because of COVID-19, is access to platforms that are accessible with assistive technology. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the platforms that post-secondary institutions, and for that matter, all educational institutions use, may not always be compatible with screen readers or braille displays, magnification software, or dictation software. And so one of the big challenges, of course, especially now, is how do students participate? So that's been a barrier I've experienced my whole life, in addition to attitudinal barriers around education from educators, service providers, and the like, as well as physical and architectural barriers in the education space. So that sort of fueled my passion around inclusive education and why I sit on the Education Standards Committee. But sort of flip-flopping a little bit to my PhD, I am coming in, like I said, I'm very excited to be coming back to Western. I should say I'm coming home, I'm coming back. I was a student at Western in 2010, 2011, and 2012. So I did my master's in occupational science, and I'm coming back. And I'm pursuing a PhD in occupational science, specifically looking at how adults with physical disabilities who access direct funded attendance services, how that impacts community engagement and community participation. And so this is especially important given a couple of things. It's important because 22% of our population lives with a disability here in Canada, but we also have an aging population. And so that aging population will age into disability. So we want to look at ways that, where possible, people can self-manage their own support and service needs at home, and how that impacts community engagement and their ability to engage and participate in the community. So why am I interested in that? Well, aside from having a disability and living with a disability since birth, I have two family members that live with disabilities that I support, and as well as several friends that live with disabilities that I would say am an ally with in the disability space. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question about, tell me a little bit about yourself.
No, I'm super happy you expressed all of these things, and we'll unpack them And I already regret that this episode is 30 minutes not long and not 1
I
hour
know.
long. But it's
I'll have
okay.
to keep my answers a little snappy.
We're gonna make the best of it. And just a small follow-up before Reese asks her question is, so you were here before as a graduate student as well at Western, and is it true that you were also involved with SOGs in some way?
I was. The rumors are true on the streets.
Aha.
It is a true rumor. In 2010, it's a kind of a funny story how I got involved with SOGs. In 2010, I noticed several of the intersections on campus did not have accessible curb cuts, audible pedestrian signals, or tactile curb markings. And so as a result, I kind of set up to ask, first of all, the Office for Students with Disabilities, what can we do about this? And they basically said, well, these are the city's intersections, so you might want to talk to SOGs. So over to SOGs I went, not really knowing what I was getting into or who I was talking to, but throughout that conversation, I learned a couple of things. One is they needed a disabilities commissioner, and would I be interested? So I guess I made a good first impression. But the second thing is that I actually had an opportunity, along with another member of SOGS, to present to the City of London around the importance of accessible street crossings on our campus. As we know, it's so important. Western Road is such a busy street, as is Sarnia Road, and we want to make sure that our students and faculty and staff and anyone who visits the campus is safe. And I'm pleased to say, although it was the day I graduated, those accessible street crossings, complete with audible signals, curb cuts, and tactile markings, were installed, ironically, the day I graduated. So I guess I just have to come back to Western to make sure they're still there.
And now you
Awesome.
have to come back. Yeah. I, for one, think that the sound for the audible crosswalk should have been geese honking, because I think that would fit Western's brand very well. But
yes, absolutely.
understandably that they need to be a little bit louder than a geese honking, because they would get drowned out by all the rest of the geese that are on campus. So you mentioned a lot, and it seems like you are a very, very busy person. When you transitioned, so you kind of mentioned that you were in the workforce, and then you did your master's, and now you're doing your PhD, and you are obviously very, very passionate about it. What made you continue your education? Is it just a matter of trying to get even more involved and trying to be a better advocate for, is disabled the correct word, or am I wrong with that?
Well, that's a great question. Maybe I'll start by answering that question. So there are different ways people like to be addressed. So some people prefer what they call person first language, so person with a disability. Some people prefer disabled person, because if we look at the social model of disability, we see that the environment disables us. So taking my example, it isn't that I can't cross the street, but if the signals aren't accessible and there's not a tactile curb cut, it's the environment that's disabling me from crossing the street. So we take that one step further. Perhaps there's not a blended curve. So somebody using a wheelchair or having a baby stroller that they're navigating isn't able to cross the street safely without that blended curb cut. So again, it's the environment disabling you. So disabled person kind of implies social model of disability. Sounds like that's a whole other podcast. We tend not to use the disabled because it others a group, and we want to sort of have a community-minded rather than an us versus them model. So myself personally, I prefer disabled person because, as you've heard off the top, there's lots of barriers in our environment that disable me. But I think back to your other question, it's a great question, and I get it a lot. Certainly you're right, advocacy and pushing the agenda forward for myself and other members of the disability community is a big part of why I went back to school, but it's a little bit more personal. I worked in frontline where I saw people who lived with pretty significant physical disabilities. And a lot of times there wasn't community resources to promote a really engaged, rich, textured life in the community. So for example, if a person with a disability required an agency to come in and provide support in the home, it was that support was structured around when it was convenient for the agency, or that when it was convenient for that staff from the agency, not around the person's needs and wishes and wants. Or for example, many clients I worked with had a capped number of hours of support they could receive in their home, and that wasn't always enough. So we were always problem solving together about how can we get really creative and flexible. So I saw that, and then I saw sort of things happening in my own family life around accessing to funding and what that meant for people in my own family. And I thought, I think the time is now to really look at how different models of support enable community participation.
Wow. Yeah. So Elizabeth, I have so many questions concerning the COVID-19 pandemic situation as well. But before I go there, I have another question about your book in 2016 that you co-authored. And it's a detailed book on the creating a culture of accessibility for the sciences. Mm-hmm. And so you provided various insights and proposals as well for the future in STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. And could you share just a couple of those advices or insights that you think really were helpful? Yes.
Yeah, so this is, I feel like everything's coming back to another Western story. So in 2010, when I started my master's, like everybody else, I had to take the dreaded statistics course. Or maybe you guys all love statistics. I'm not a fan, but I had to take it. And there was a lot of graphs and charts and data and scatter plots, and the list goes on. And I have still a good friend of mine, and at the time had a wonderful tutor who was really creative and tried to work with me. But the biggest barrier was accessing that visual data and visual information. And it really impeded my ability to understand some of the critical concepts in the course. And so fast forward a few years, I was working with my co-author, Dr. Mahadeo Sukai, and we were kind of talking about what some of those barriers were. And he was approached to write a book, and he invited me to co-author it, and I'm really excited. And one of the things that I've just discovered that I'm super, super excited about is sonar graphs. So it's a gentleman at SAS Graphics, and he takes visual graphs and he turns them into sound. So the X line has a certain pitch, and then the Y axis has a certain pitch, and you can listen to these different pitches as it plays out a graph for you on your computer. It's really brilliant, and I wish it was something that was around 10 plus years ago when I was in school. But I think aside from that, part of why I co-authored the book is really about getting the message out to service providers, parents, educators, and even students that aside from STEM, it's really about thinking creatively about how to navigate barriers in education. So one chapter that I'm really proud of is the barrier around practical spaces, so that whether that's co-op placements or whether that's an occupational therapy lab or physical therapy lab, and how to kind of access those as a student with a disability. And you know, some of the challenges around a lot of professional programs don't allow you to take a part-time option or reduced course load. So what impact does that have on a student who might need more time to complete that coursework?
Thank you.
So you mentioned it kind of piqued my interest because I'm a geographer, so I make maps and I do a lot of GIS and stuff. So
cool.
You mentioned like being able to visually see data, like how, I guess I hope I'm using the right terminology and I don't want to offend anything, but as an able-bodied person that can see, that can touch, that can hear, that can do everything, I take it for granted. Like I don't really question why there's a dip in the sidewalk, or if there's sounds going off, or like I can read pages and I can read data and stuff like that. How far do you think Western has to go before we can reach a fully inclusive campus that is available for everybody of all different walks of life, so that way they can continue their education the way an able-bodied person can? Is that also the right terminology?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and a great able-bodied is a fine term. At least from my perspective. I think one of the things that, and I was just having this conversation with somebody today, is a challenge, not just for Western, but for every not just post-secondary, but every institution that provides education, is funding. So let's be honest, the Office for Students with Disabilities has a certain amount of funding that they're given to work with. And so the challenge is, that impacts the services that students can get. So, perhaps there are more students coming in every year, but the funding stays the same. So how do you offer services in a way that are robust? So, I mean, one thing, for example, that I struggle with is that there's a lot of inconsistencies in terms of what different institutions offer. Some will offer a note taker in class, some will not. Some will offer tutoring services. Some say you're on your own, you got to figure it out. Carleton University, for example, offers to students with physical disabilities the option to have attendance services on campus. So what that means is if you're a student with a physical disability and you are attending Carleton University or Algonquin College and you're living in residence, you can have help with any of your personal support needs from trained attendants on campus. So Carleton and Algonquin are the only ones that offer this service. Some universities like York partner with community agencies to offer it. Some universities just again say that's your responsibility. So I guess what I feel as a student, like there's a lot of inconsistencies when I talk with I'm a part of a PhD and master's group for students who are blind, and I will mention something that Western has. So, let's give Western a little cred here. They've got our, I don't know what it's called, but it's the bus that picks you up if you have a disability and takes you from class to class, or yes. So they've got the bus on campus for students with disabilities just on campus. It's great. I love that, especially in the winter, or if I was going to a building on campus that I didn't know how to get to, or I wanted to go to the grad club and have an amazing grilled cheese and it's a snowy night. Perfect. Call the bus. So to give Western a little credit, a lot of schools do not have that. So consistency to me is huge. Like what one school has, another may not. And I think that's due in large part to student advocates. So I happen to know the person that advocated for that bus to be on campus. I'd like to think I did my little part for some accessible pedestrian walk signals on campus. And I think a lot of the times it falls to the student body to advocate through organizations like SOGS or the undergraduate equivalent of SOGS.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, so Elizabeth, we live in unprecedented times. I mean, the kinds of difficulties that we normally face are just made a lot worse given the pandemic. I wanted to know more about your experiences as someone who's a vision impaired graduate student, and what you think, what unique difficulties you might face in that situation as well. Could you let us know more about your experiences in navigating on campus, for example?
So because of COVID, I haven't been to campus since October when I came to give a guest lecture at King's. I was supposed to come in March and then poof, COVID hit. So I didn't come for that second guest lecture. I think there's a couple of things. So it certainly impacted everyone's ability to go to campus. For me, as somebody with a visual disability, one thing I worry about when we gradually return in whatever form and shape that takes, how will I know where the social distancing measures have been put in place? So are there going to be markers on the UCC floor telling me, stand this far behind the person in front of you in line and go get your food in this section, and here's the Purell station? So how is all that going to be marked? When you're navigating the UCC food court, for example, or when you're in a lecture hall, knowing where to sit and what that signage is going to look like. I think protocols too around wearing masks. So there's advantages wearing masks. They keep us safe, but it's also hard for me to hear when someone's wearing a mask. It's hard for me to understand them. If I'm wearing a mask, it's harder for me to hear my environment around me. For people that are deaf or hard of hearing, it's difficult for them to read lips. So all of these things play into what that experience is going to look like. But more importantly, I attended the town hall that Alan Shepard had a few weeks ago. And I didn't hear a whole lot of talk around what COVID planning looks like for students, not just for students with disabilities, but how it's going to include students with disabilities in that planning, especially around sort of the wayfinding and the signage piece.
Yeah, we need to improve a lot in some of these areas, especially in basic communication as well. We recently had a town hall, but it didn't seem like a town hall since we weren't really able to speak directly in any capacity, which was unfortunate. But we are heading in some good directions, and more work, I guess, needs to be done. Reese, can I ask just one follow-up question on COVID as well?
Yep.
Sure, yeah. So while we're on this topic, I was really surprised. I shouldn't be surprised, and tell me if I'm mistaken about this. So, I mean, of course, the government says we're looking after the most vulnerable people, especially when it comes to COVID-19. And so we have CESB, Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, roughly $2,000 for anyone who lost a job due to COVID-19, or I think the first one was CERB, and the second one is CESB, the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit for students. Now that's roughly $1,250 as well. But is it true that if you are getting, say, Ontario Disability Support Program funding, which is $11.65, I think?
Yeah.
And so it's low, and you're not eligible for CERB and CESB, and yet you're getting a lower fund, even though you're more vulnerable. So how does it feel when you hear statements that we're looking after the most vulnerable people, and yet it seems like somewhat the opposite is happening, or it's not happening the way it ought to happen?
That's a great point. So I think a couple of things to unpack there. The 1165 that ODSP grants, and I can't speak to what it is for Ontario Works. I don't know. I know it's lower than 1165. That in Toronto, and I'm sure it's not that far off in London, that doesn't even cover rent. ODSP is not keeping up with the cost of living. Not only is it not keeping up with the cost of living, it's not keeping up to the needs of people during COVID. So there was a $100 extra bonus you could apply for if you were on ODSP, but $100 doesn't get you very far. So maybe you're somebody living with a disability who's needing now to order groceries in to be delivered, as so many of my friends and colleagues do, because you're not able to go out. You're medically compromised, medically fragile. So you're ordering groceries in. Well, that's not free. Somebody's got to pay for that delivery. You're ordering PPE so that your support staff has PPE to wear. You're maybe ordering perhaps more medical supplies than you would. You're ordering your medications now via prescription, and you're paying for that. The list goes on of what you're paying for in addition, and the $100 isn't cutting it. But yes, it is interesting that when a crisis hits in our world and all of a sudden the able-bodied population needs support, it's here's $2,000 a month. But when the disability population requires support, whether that be financial or medical, it's here's $11.75. And I think what that speaks to is the way in which our policies and society really devalue disability. And I think it's based on a very sort of I would say a notion around productivity and what it means to be productive. And if you can't participate in sort of that capitalist productivity market because of your disability, what does that say about how you are being supported by our government?
I know a couple of my friends, she is in the same boat as probably some of your friends. She's had a heart transplant, and she is severely immunocompromised, and she can't go outside. It's a matter of life or death for her. And I know that $100 like it's just enough to cover medication and just enough food. And with the increased costs of buying Lysol wipes and PPE and all of that stuff, it makes it very, very difficult. And along with almost the mental stigma as well, like the people that are on ODSP, like they can't work. It's preventing them from going to work. And now all of these able-bodied people are inside and they're like, oh, I don't know what to do, like all this kind of stuff. And then there's people that are on ODSP or on Ontario Works or that kind of stuff, and that is their day-to-day life, that they can't go outside, that they're stuck inside, they don't know, like they have to keep themselves busy. And the shift in, I think now it's become more of a normal that like people are staying inside more and people have hobbies and people, all that kind of stuff. But that also comes at a cost. Like hobbies aren't free. Like there are things that are expensive, and groceries are expensive, and delivery costs are going up. And it's quite a shame that now that we're moving into like phase 2 and even into phase 3, that we're forgetting that the pandemic is still a thing, and we're just trying to keep on like normal life.
Yeah, that's really interesting. A couple of things you brought up for me really were striking there. So when this whole thing, COVID thing started in March, I gave a guest lecture to the King's College Disability Studies class around one of the disability studies courses around crip wisdom. And so the idea that, hey, as someone with a disability, I might be really used to being inside and having a lot of my connections via the internet and having to order groceries online and having to bank online. It's amazing how many of my friends, totally able-bodied, including my parents, were calling me in March being like, help, I've never ordered anything online, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, oh yeah, I got this, I've been doing this for a decade. So it's really cool that we have something to teach. But kind of simultaneously at the same time, it's really interesting how things that were once seen as this accommodation in air quotes are now just normal. So working at home is something that I'm really familiar with. I've done it for years. I'm lucky I've had employers that have been very supportive, but a lot of my friends and colleagues in the disability community have said, whoa, now everybody's working at home and it's the norm. I've tried to advocate because of my health needs to work at home for years, and it was just never possible. But now we have a pandemic and we can. Or another really interesting thing is how we've been really creative about how we socialize. And I hope that as much as sometimes at the end of a day, I just want nothing more than to shut Zoom down for the night and run from Zoom, I hope we don't lose some of these great online meetings, because for some people, they're the only outlet. So the Zoom chats, the Zoom pub nights, the Zoom trivias, the whatevers, the online tutorials that some profs have been doing, they are the outlet for some people. And I hope that we don't lose those when we go back to whatever semblance of normal we go back to, because for some people, this has actually opened up their world. COVID has really taken a world that was 4 walls in an apartment and brought to that person a whole realm of activities available online.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you very much. And I guess we're just about to at the end of our show. So is there any social media links that you would like to share with us, with anyone who may want to get in touch with you? Sure, go ahead.
So you can follow me at Twitter. So on Twitter, so at Mohler, Mohler, the letter C. So at Mohlerc, and I'll make sure that that's in your transcript as well. And you can also, of course, find me on LinkedIn, Elizabeth Mohler, Facebook, Elizabeth Mohler. And I do have a blog called The Writer's Table, and I'll pop that in the transcript as well.
Well, thank you so much. And I think we would probably have you again on our show once you start your PhD. We'll discuss more about your research in particular and what you've been doing at that time. Now, I guess this is at the end. So this has been the GradCast official radio show and podcast of the Society of Graduate Students at Western University. I've been your host, Yusuf, and my co-host was?
Reese Patterson.
Yes, and we've been speaking with Elizabeth Mohler, and this episode was produced by Ariel Frame. If you would like to be involved with the show or get in contact with us, email us at gradcastradio@gmail.com. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter at gradcastradio. To listen to us, we are on the radio at CHRW 94.9 FM. You can also find all of our episodes on our website at gradcast.ca or on podcast apps like Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Alternatively, select podcasts have been uploaded on YouTube at Gradcast Radio. Thank you for listening and have a great night.